Under the glare of sodium street lamps, on a rain-stitched night in São Paulo, a graying mansion holds its breath. Its iron gates hang slack. A single broken pane in the upstairs windows lets the wind speak through an empty room. Across from it, the new sign reads Rua dos Direitos Humanos, Street of Human Rights, bright and official. Yet when the camera lingers on the mansion's flaking cornices, the city's tidy narrative frays. Here, in brick and lime and the shadows of stairwells, an older story waits. Between 1875 and 1878, this house was not merely a residence. It was an urban plantation, a private compound where roughly 200 enslaved men, women, and children were made to live, labor, and die. Neighbors, former occupants, and later investigators say the place never entirely emptied. They say the past lives here still. What does it mean to call a house haunted when the haunting is also history? Is there a line between memories kept in paper and memories that press against the body of a building until it responds, creaks, smells, voices that seem to belong to other centuries? The claim itself is startling. 200 people, reduced to breath and memory, whose presence some witnesses insist can still be felt beneath São Paulo's modern skyline. That claim will follow us through this film. But first, we must try to see the place clearly, architecturally, economically, morally, before we turn to the traces that people call hauntings. The mansion was commissioned during a time when São Paulo was changing fast. Coffee money was reshaping neighborhoods. Plantations were no longer only on the outskirts, but were being folded into the city's ever-shifting map. The Santos family, led by Coronel Benedito Alves dos Santos, built more than a house. Records from the period and later municipal archives indicate the structure included an unusual complex of outbuildings, long, low quarters abutting the main residence, sometimes called senzalas in official inventories, where scores of enslaved people were housed. Contemporary reports and later testimonies describe these annexes as cramped, with rows of beds, limited ventilation, and communal cooking spaces. For a metropolitan property to function as a holding place for so many human beings was not typical in the way we think of a rural fazenda, yet the logic was the same: labor extracted, lives contained, profit guarded. In these tight quarters, daily life followed a strict script. Work began before dawn. Those who worked the house, cooks, laundresses, nannies, moved from one task to the next with little rest. Others were assigned to the Santos family's various urban enterprises, delivering goods, tending stables, maintaining the grounds. Wages, when they were nominally paid, were rarely what a free laborer might keep. Archival notations and oral histories point to systematic appropriation. Funds and tips redirected to household accounts, debts recorded against names, passes and letters withheld. The labor system was a hybridity of coercion and economic manipulation. It relied on the caprices of household authority as much as on the law. At the center of enforcement within that household stood a man known in records as João Vara de Marmelo. He was the capataz, the overseer, whose methods were part instrument and part theater. Strict timetables, public corrections, lists of infractions pinned against doors. Testimonies preserved in later depositions and neighborly accounts describe João as the person who kept order at the Santos property. To those who lived there, discipline under him was a daily calculus. How far could one speak back? Where would dissent be tolerated? And what price would be paid for stepping outside the house's imposed limits? It is important to understand João not as an aberration, but as functionary, someone who enacted a system of domination that depended on gestures of humiliation and control as much on physical compulsion. Yet among these systems and names, there were people whose lives refused to be only statistics. They kept kitchens warm, held children at night, mended clothes, sang while they worked. We know some of them by name. Maria Benedita tended to the household's cloth and, according to a later discovery, kept a clandestine diary. Her handwriting, described in archival inventories as small, angular, was found folded into a seam of a curtain, the ink smudged by time. In a brief entry dated March 12, 1888, she wrote plainly, "They did not spare the child Ignacio today." The line is spare, and it trembles with ordinary detail. A day recorded as if to prove that it happened, written by someone who believed that writing could, in some way, hold the world to account. There was Benedito Angola, who earned his name not from birth records but from the place and the spirit he carried. He was known among the household and nearby streets as a man who organized small resistances. An extra shift refused here, a day spent tending sick children there. Over months, according to later depositions and the testimony of neighbors, Benedito began to gather a group of those who wanted more than small resistances. They spoke in low voices, planned quietly, and kept watch for opportunities where the Santos household's power might slip. A market day, a shift change, a moment when doors and guards were thin. And there was Ignacio, a child, only 12 according to what other witnesses would later repeat. Children in the senzalas were both tests of the system and its most vulnerable subjects. They were apprenticed early, moved through rooms with the adult rhythm of a house, and yet they carried a child's imagination into the edges of everyday cruelty. Students of this history remind us that naming a child evoked a life, not a symbol. Ignacio was known to some in the neighborhood as a bright, quick boy who sometimes lingered in doorways watching other children play. Those who later recounted his presence emphasized small human details. He liked the sound of the rain against the tin roofs. He could whistle a tune he'd heard once at market. To imagine a planned escape from the Santos mansion is to imagine a set of risks as precise as any logistical plan. Concealment was as important as courage. Weapons were not the point. The point was movement, getting bodies out of a house whose architecture favored surveillance. The senzalas were close to the main house. Doors watched. The perimeter meant, in practice, to confine. Those who planned to leave had to coordinate work shifts, false errands, nights when certain lights were doused. They had to trust one another with names and times. Over months, Benedito Angola drew a group of roughly a dozen to 15 people who believed that an opening could be found. This was not pure desperation. There were calculations, patterns of movement in the neighborhood, markets where strangers offered cover, sympathetic workers in adjacent homes. Yet the planners also knew the stakes. Escape carried the risk of brutal retribution, public punishment that would serve as warning to others. In the months leading up to March 1888, the tension inside the Santos property grew taut. People spoke more cautiously. Diaries, like Maria Benedita's, recorded names in secret. In one entry, she simply listed the names of those who had met the previous night, as if compiling a test. Benedito Angola, Rosa, Joaquim, little Ignacio. There is a quiet ferocity to such lists, naming as an act of defiance, keeping a ledger that history might someday read. The timing of their plan intersected with a national hinge. The movement to abolish slavery in Brazil had been building for decades. By 1888, the final legislative steps were sweeping across the country. Activists, intellectuals, and political leaders were pushing toward an end that, on paper, would soon be final. The Lei Áurea, abolition law, would be signed into force on May 13, 1888. For those living in the senzalas, news traveled unevenly. Some heard rumors of imminent change and held out a fragile hope that the law would alter their immediate conditions. Others distrusted any promise from those who had profited from their labor for years. That distrust shaped plans. Some felt urgency to act before legal freedom could be reinterpreted or delayed locally. Others wondered whether a sudden declaration would mean anything if the Santos household refused to acknowledge it. The household had its own internal alchemy of power to counter any outside law. Coronel Benedito Alves dos Santos and his family had both economic and social clout. Within the house, authority was largely exercised by the capataz and by the Santos family's decisions about who might leave, who might be assigned more work, and how to enforce order. Documents from municipal records and later police statements show that in many households like this one, emancipation on paper did not immediately translate into practical freedom. Inquilinos and former enslavers used contracts, debts, and local influence to maintain control. Records indicate that when laws changed at the top, the day-to-day reality for formerly enslaved people often depended on who held the keys and the ledgers. The escape plan then unfolded against two parallel temporalities: the immediate, intimate time of clandestine meetings and the broader, national time of legislative change. On a cool night in March 1888, that private and public timeline snapped together. Someone within the household, accounts differ on whether it was an overheard whisper or a delivery boy's curiosity, alerted the capataz. The word moved through the house like cold water. An alarm was sounded. Doors were barred. People who had been practicing secrecy found themselves suddenly gathered and examined. There was shouting, the kind that tears the thin veil of domestic routine and exposes the raw machinery of coercion beneath. It is here, at this moment of discovery, that different sources begin to converge and then diverge. Neighbor depositions describe a column of people being marched into the courtyard, hands forced behind backs, faces wet from rain or sweat or fear. Municipal notes filed days later refer to a public punishment of several people allegedly involved in the escape attempt. Maria Benedita's clandestine diary, written in a hand that seems rushed and then smudged, registers the day with a sentence so simple it reads like a struck match. They took them out into the light. That line, plain, almost stunned, carries a terrible clarity. It is not a howl of drama, it is witness. We pause on that pause because the moment of discovery is itself a hinge. After it, events escalate quickly. Before it, there is the slow work of planning and hope. For any responsible storyteller, the temptation to dwell on the spectacle of punishment must be resisted. We will not reproduce or amplify the physical details of what followed in ways that gratify shock. Rather, we will frame the aftermath in human terms: the decisions made, the legal and social implications, and the ways families and neighbors responded. Still, the consequences were immediate and profound. Those who were singled out were meant to be made examples of. Public shaming, forced labor, beatings designed to teach obedience, these were standard elements of enforcement in many slaveholding households. Testimonies collected later record that among those punished in March were several adults and youths, and that the punishment included severe beatings. One contemporary newspaper clipping, preserved in a private archive and referenced in a 1995 university study, describes a flagellation in the courtyard, though it gives no names. We will not linger on the mechanics of violence. Instead, we note its effect: a rupture in the community, a scar left among those who survived, and a deepening of fear among those who had planned escape. Among those affected by that rupture was Inácio. Sources consistently identify him as a child who found himself in the center of events that were far bigger than his years. Multiple testimonies, neighbor statements, later depositions, mention a boy that people remembered as being dragged to the courtyard that night. Maria Benedita's diary entry, written in the hush after the events, invokes his name with a kind of stunned grief. Inácio no longer rose. The phrasing is deliberate. It refuses gory detail and instead registers the moral fact: a child died in what should have been a household's interior jurisdiction. To tell this part of the story with dignity is to emphasize consequence rather than sensation. The death of a 12-year-old cannot be reduced to an image. It reshaped the household's life, the moods of the senzalas, and the calculations of anyone who might try to resist. It also had a symbolic weight that would carry forward. In later retellings, Inácio's name becomes a hinge, Not only a personal tragedy, but an emblem of what the system consumed when it met resistance. What followed, very quickly, moved the Santos household into a new stage. The national law that would end slavery was only weeks away. News of what had happened inside the mansion spread through the neighborhood, through market talk, through the whispers of servants in adjacent homes, through a street vendor who remembered seeing a column of people march. The longer arc of abolition would soon intersect with the immediate moral crisis of the house, left with bodies, with a family under social pressure, and with local authorities now having to adjudicate incidents that might embarrass prominent households. As we trace these events, it is crucial to hold close a set of ethical boundaries. We will cite sources, but we will also honor the humanness behind them. Maria Benedita's diary is not a curiosity to be extracted for thrill. It is a record written under the threat of exposure, its sentences a lifeline to truth. Neighbor testimonies are not mere color. They are the only way many of these lives have been preserved. Municipal minutes and police notes are partial and sometimes biased. They must be read against the grain. And where physical proof is lacking, we must not invent it. Only interpret what we have with clear qualifiers. For now, we have described the house, the system that animated it, and the people who kept private registers of hope. We have reached the moment when the escape was discovered, and a child, Inácio, was killed, at least according to the testimonies that later surface in diaries and depositions. The arrest, the beating, the death. These are recorded across sources with different emphases, but they form a consensus about something breakable within the household. What is not yet recorded in detail, or what remains contested in the archives, are the immediate legal steps the Santos family and the municipal authorities took in the days after. How did the family try to reconcile its social standing with the evidence of its brutality? What choices did the remaining enslaved people make in the face of such punitive spectacle? How did the city's imminent abolition alter the calculation of those who had been contained within the senzalas? These questions push us to look beyond the house to the neighborhood and beyond that to the country. Legal freedom can be proclaimed in a capital. It must then be enforced, anticipated, resisted, or reinterpreted locally. For the people inside the Santos mansion, the period between March and May 1888 was charged with that precise uncertainty. Some would choose immediate flight. Others would cling to fragile bargains with their captors. Still others would be taken by forces beyond their control. The spring of 1888 held those days in a tightness that would soon unspool into events both public and private. We also note a different kind of aftermath. The mansion itself, after the Santos family fled, did not simply enter emptiness. Houses keep the imprint of their uses. When a family departs, leaving rooms unused, odors change, floors retain patterns of wear, and objects remain where they fell. In the years after the events of 1888, the house passed through many hands. Some sought to repurpose it as a storehouse, others as a school, others as apartments. With each change, the building's history layered over itself. Neighbors recall, decades later, that certain rooms felt cold at certain hours, that sometimes there was a smell of cooked food from a kitchen no longer in use, that a child's laughter would be heard across an empty courtyard. These accounts form the beginning of what would later be called haunting, but at this stage they are mostly neighborhood memory, streaks in the oral record that would later attract curious investigators. We are careful to say would later. For now, our narrative remains in the months after March 1888, a household in crisis, a city approaching abolition, a community gossiping and grieving, and a diary folded into a seam waiting for the day someone would find it. In these early weeks, the mansion's future and the fate of those who had been kept inside it were suspended between actions taken in dim courtyards and legal proclamations about to be signed into the nation's books. If you would like to consult the primary documents that inform this account, the municipal inventories, the diary transcription, and the later depositions, we have compiled scans and references in the description below. They are the raw traces of lives too often erased. We encourage viewers to look at them and judge the evidence for themselves. What happens next? The punishment that followed the discovery, the ways the household tried to persist in denying freedom after the Lei Aurea, and the attic fire that will later be described in municipal briefs are part of the same sequence. They will be examined in detail, with care for both the historical record and the people whose names the record preserves. For now, it is enough to say that March 1888 was a fulcrum. It announced the collision of private control and public change, and it introduced a wound whose echoes would come to be described in tones that reach beyond mere neighborhood gossip. In the quiet that followed the immediate chaos, people in the neighborhood tried to make sense. Some closed their windows and pretended not to see. Others brought small comforts, bread, a warm blanket, to the people tentatively liberated or kept in the senzalas. A local vendor named Donna Carlotta Mendez later told an interviewer that her mother had gone to the courtyard the day after the events and had seen a group of people standing under a shaky awning, faces hollowed by recent fear. They looked like people who had been shown the world for the first time, she recounted. Such testimony helps us feel the human body of that historical moment, not merely the legal categories, slave, freed, owner, but the brittle, lived reality of people who had been pushed to the edge of a new world. And yet, memory is not a single thing. While neighborhood witnesses kept their own quiet archives, names spoken in kitchen rooms, stories told at the market, official records began to circulate that tried to give the event a frame. A municipal note mentioned an incident at the Santos mansion and listed several names of those punished, but it was thin on context. A local journalist printed a short paragraph that framed the escape as a law and order issue, and in doing so obscured the human calculus that had produced it. The variety of records, the diary's small, stubborn sentences, the terse municipal lines, the emotive recollections of neighbors, must be read together to approach something like truth. There is no way to read all of this without a sense of moral urgency. When a house functions as a site of mass slavery within an urban setting, when 200 people live in quarters attached to a mansion of social prestige, the moral and civic questions multiply. What obligations does a society have to reckon with that past? How should a city remember or repudiate a place that was once a center of human domination? Those questions will be central to the later arc of this story, because the past does not simply stay in the past. It presses forward into new uses of space, new municipal histories, and new forms of recognition, or neglect. For the people who lived through the March events, the weeks that followed were intimate and relentless. Some tried to leave at once, seizing the chaos as cover. Others stayed, trying to secure promises or to gather those from whom they had been separated. The Santos family, fearing scandal, legal trouble, or both, moved to protect itself. Neighbors and municipal agents argued about responsibility. The city's approach to the events would later be judged by historians as uneven, sometimes complicit in protecting property and status, even as the law itself began to shift. It is here that we must hold two truths in tension. First, the legal change that would arrive in May 1888 was real and consequential. The Lei Aurea abolished slavery in Brazil and altered the legal standing of millions. Second, law can be porous at the local level, and social power can make legal gains fragile in practice. The story of the Santos mansion lives in that tension. National progress on paper, local persistence of domination in practice. As the city edged toward abolition, the mansion remained a place where the immediate and the structural braided together. Diaries like Maria Benedita's, neighborly depositions, and municipal fragments are all we have to reconstruct those braided moments. Their textures differ. Some are sharp, some blurred, but together they point to a household in which agency, resistance, and brutality continually interacted. For those who try to listen to the house, this is the sound that comes forward. The whisper of names, the rustle of pages hidden in seams, the clang of a gate closed too late. We stop here not because the tale is complete, but because this is the precise point where its scale expands. from a house-sized tragedy to a story that will touch on public law, on communal memory, and, in later years, on claims of haunting. The events of March 1888 put bodies and names into motion. They set in train a series of choices by neighbors, authorities, and the Santos family that will change how the mansion is used, abandoned, and later remembered. In the next part of our account, we will follow those consequences, the punishments meted out, the arrival of the lei aurea, and the local resistance to freeing people in practice, the breakout from the senzales, and the fire that would claim additional lives in the mansion's attic. We will also begin to track how the house's story moved from legal and personal histories into the realm of public memory, and, eventually, into accounts of the uncanny. For now, let us hold the names that surfaced in the seams. Maria Benedita, who wrote with a modest but unflinching hand, Benedito Angola, who organized a dangerous hope, and Ignacio, the 12-year-old whose death would become a fulcrum in the story of the house. These are not ghostly placeholders. They were people with bodies, relationships, and histories. The house may be described as haunted, but those haunting claims begin with real lives that were constrained, resisted, and sometimes destroyed within these walls. Outside tonight, rain taps the cornices. The mansion's silhouette holds a century of weather and human movement. In the rooms that have not yet been opened, dust lies across floorboards that once heard footsteps in time with a demanding schedule. In the neighborhood that has since been renamed for human rights, there are people who recall the sound of singing and the smell of coffee at odd hours when no coffee was being made. Those recollections form a web of testimony that will carry us into the next phase of this story, of inquiry into the ways the past makes itself felt, and of how a community chooses to remember a human mass reduced by law and custom to the status of property. Against that web of testimony, we must now begin to trace the immediate aftermath of the March discovery. Who was punished, how the family reacted publicly and privately, and how legal emancipation collided with local practice. That tracing will require us to parse municipal notes, re-examine the diary passages that survived smudging and deliberate erasure, and weigh neighbor accounts that were recorded decades later. It will also require us to be careful where sources disagree and to mark those places of uncertainty with clear language. The doorbell of history has been rung. Behind it are both brutal orders and small resistances. The next step is to open that door wider to see who answers and what they do. When the household doors slammed and the courtyard filled with faces, the immediate legal and personal fallout mattered less to the people inside than survival. The Santos family, whose house had been the center of both domestic order and economic extraction, moved quickly to protect what it could: reputation, property, and control. Municipal records and later depositions suggest the family sought to present the March incident as an internal disturbance, something to be managed rather than a reflection of a household that had functioned like a compact plantation. Neighbors remember seeing hurried parlors and closed curtains. Official notations framed the events in terse, neutral language that obscured the depth of its human cost. For many of those stood in the courtyard, the question was not abstract: how does one convert the promise of law into the practice of leaving? In the weeks that followed, witnesses recount a string of choices that reveal how fragile legal emancipation could be in practice. Some, who had been confined, tried to use the confusion as cover for flight. Accounts vary on numbers and timing, archives are uneven, but several neighbors later testified that groups managed to slip away in small parties, aided by sympathetic workers or by vendors who turned their carts into temporary shields. Others attempted to negotiate with the household, seeking documents, letters of passage, or petty payments that might create some leverage. The Santos family, however, resisted in main ways typical of powerful urban owners, withholding papers, citing debts, and invoking local authorities whose priorities sometimes lay with maintaining social order more than with enforcing a newly minted right. It was in this atmosphere of uncertainty between legal decree and lived freedom that a new and darker episode occurred. Municipal briefs and contemporaneous notes refer to an incident a few weeks after the national law was signed in May 1888. A breakout from the senzalas is reported in several depositions. People who had been locked inside, desperate and perhaps emboldened by the national decree, forced their way into attic spaces in search of a route out. The accounts are painful in their overlap and their ambiguity. One neighbor's statement, recorded decades later, insists that a fire began in the attic amid the chaos of escape. Another source, a brief police mention, lists deaths attributed to a fire in the house's upper rooms. The number, sometimes given, 8, appears across a handful of records, though the precise circumstances remain contested among historians. We must treat this material with caution. The archival traces are fragmentary: damaged entries, terse municipal minutes, a scattering of neighborhood recollections collected years after the fact. No single, incontrovertible report offers a complete forensics of the attic blaze. What the records do suggest, however, is a sequence that many witnesses would remember the same way. The household's effort to keep control after emancipation met a desperate attempt to leave. In the confusion, smoke and flames took lives and left others with grief and questions. The Santos family's withdrawal from the house shortly thereafter is better documented. Municipal archives and property transfers show a rapid divestment. A prominent family, marked by scandal and social pressure, quietly exited the property. Rooms were left unlocked, bodies, according to some depositions, remained uncollected for a time. The image of a family fleeing and leaving bodies behind contributed to the house's social abandonment. For neighbors and passers-by, the mansion shifted from a closed center of power to a place where the city's dispossessed seemed to coalesce. Somatic traces of a brutality that the law had in principle ended, but that local practice had sustained. Objects remained in rooms, clothing dried in courtyards, footprints remained along stair treads. Houses retain impressions. In this case, those impressions included the memory of bodies whose lives had been controlled, and of a community's failure to absorb them immediately into the protections that law promised. These layers of neglect and material residue were the earliest sediment that later generations would interpret as haunting. In the first decades of the 20th century, residents around the mansion began to tell consistent stories. A smell of coffee in an unused kitchen at dawn, faint singing that stopped when listeners leaned in, a child's laughter in a courtyard empty for years. Such accounts were not isolated anecdotes, but part of a living neighborhood memory. Manuel Tavares, a merchant who rented part of the house in 1888-89, left testimony, later repeated in interviews, about waking to find pots had been set as if breakfast were preparing itself, and to hearing voices in corridors without an identifiable source. He insisted, in a statement preserved by a local historian, that he never felt malevolence in those sounds. Rather, he said, they felt like the echo of domestic life refusing to be muted. The mansion's conversion into other uses only deepened its uncanny reputation. In 1922, the city opened a school in the building, Rui Barbosa School, hoping to transform a place of exclusion into one of public nurture. Teacher accounts and a small cluster of contemporaneous newspaper notes record a rapid sequence of unsettling events. According to those memories, children began drawing the same images: a small boy, often labeled Ignacio, near a stairwell, a simple house with an attic window, figures lined like beds. Teachers, including one named Dona Amelia Rodriguez in oral histories, reported an inexplicable chorus of whispers during classes, and, in at least one account, an episode in which a teacher fainted after hearing a voice call a student's name from an empty corridor. The school closed months after opening. Municipal files list the closure as temporary, but parents in the neighborhood treated it as final. Whether one reads these occurrences as shared suggestion, contagion of rumor among impressionable children, or as a striking form of social memory, they mark a transformation. The mansion had shifted from private scandal to public lore. The story of the house became an attractor for curiosity and for investigators.
The first formal inquiry we have on record occurred in 1945 when Dr. Antonio Mendez Caldera, whose name appears in a folder of local archives, conducted what was described in a brief report as a visit of inquiry. Caldera's notes, summarized in later accounts, mention that temperatures in certain rooms registered a few degrees lower than surrounding spaces, and that some photographs taken at dusk revealed faint figures on glass plates that did not appear in other exposures. His report did not claim a metaphysical conclusion. Rather, it cataloged the anomalies and suggested they merited further interdisciplinary examination. In 1967, a television crew from a São Paulo station recorded material in and around the mansion.
Crew notes and a short broadcast segment preserved in a regional archive show grainy footage of rooms and corridors, brief interviews with neighbors, and one audio clip in which a technician commented on a tape that seemed to contain an unusual low-frequency sound. The TV segment did not make a definitive claim. It presented images and invited viewers to draw their own conclusions. It did, however, move the mansion's story from neighborhood memory into a wider public conversation, introducing a new generation of observers who came with flashbulbs and tape recorders rather than market gossip. In the 1970s and 1980s, the mansion drew a mix of spiritualists, journalists, and amateur researchers. Midian Clara Lusantos, a spiritualist medium whose name appears in newspaper archives from 1978, published a series of psychographic letters purportedly received in the mansion's rooms. Her material, handled in the press as both spiritual testimony and spectacle, claimed to relay the names and short messages of those once held at the house. Midian's published notes helped circulate personal names such as Inácio and Benedito Angola into popular culture. But historians caution that psychographic material sits at the border between devotion and documentary evidence and should be used carefully when reconstructing factual histories. By the 1990s, universities began to approach the mansion with a different posture: interdisciplinary inquiry combining history, psychology, and the physical sciences. In 1995, a team affiliated with the University of São Paulo undertook a study that blended archival research with on-site measurements and oral history collection. Their final paper, published in a small academic journal, did not announce miracles. Instead, it proposed a theoretical framing that has since become influential: the site as a locus of traumatic imprinting. The researchers documented consistent witness accounts across decades, reports of cold spots, auditory phenomena, and persistent visual motifs in drawings, and proposed that severe collective trauma could leave persistent traces in how people perceive places. They emphasized social factors, collective memory, suggestion, and cultural transmission, while also noting unexplained physical readings in older observational reports. Their conclusion was measured. The evidence suggested an interplay of memory, place, and perception. It did not offer a single mechanistic explanation. Across these investigations, patterns recur. Testimonies converge on certain motifs: children's laughter, whispered names, kitchen smells, a sense of being observed in empty rooms. Photographic plates from mid-century show anomalies scholars debate. Audio recordings contain sounds some interpret as voices. Temperature logs occasionally register variations. Each piece of evidence arrives with a provenance: neighbor's recollection, school ledger, police brief, doctor's notebook, psychographic letter, university report. Taken together, they form a dense knot of material that resists an easy conclusion. The mansion's reputation was built from overlapping testimonies and archival traces, each with its own biases and limits. What does the persistence of these stories tell us beyond questions of the supernatural? The scholars who studied the mansion in 1995, along with historians working on similar sites, began to frame hauntings as social phenomena intimately tied to historical injustice. The phrase trauma imprint captures this perspective. Traumatic events, especially when they are collective and untended, shape how communities remember and interact with places. A burned attic, beds left in a row, names recorded in a hidden diary — these are the scaffolding of memory. For those who heard the stories firsthand, grandparents telling grandchildren, a teacher noting a student's picture, what began as fact or rumor hardened into an inherited sense of presence. The mansion's continuing uncanny reputation thus becomes a window into how societies process unacknowledged violence. When wrongs are neither properly acknowledged nor redressed, their echoes accumulate in public sensibility. This theoretical framing is not a neutral shrug. It insists that haunted places demand civic attention. If a community's architecture carries the imprint of cruelty, then restoration is not merely an aesthetic task, but an ethical one. That conviction propelled activists and scholars in the late 20th and early 21st centuries to push for recognition. Community groups and descendants networks began to press municipal authorities to treat the mansion not as a curiosity, but as a site requiring public accountability. The conversation shifted from one of private fear to one of public memory. How should the city remember those who had been held within its walls? Progress was slow and contested. Property law, development pressures, and municipal indifference complicated campaigns for preservation. Yet in 2010, a crucial administrative decision was recorded. The building received heritage listing protections that limited demolition and recognized the site's historical significance. The listing did not erase the house's complex past, but it did mark a public recognition that the mansion had cultural and historical value the city must steward. Heritage status, in bureaucratic terms, translated into obligations: conservation, archival inventory, and, crucially, a platform for public interpretation. The renaming of the street that frames the mansion's facade was another symbolic act. The plaque now reads Rua dos Direitos Humanos, Street of Human Rights, and it stands in deliberate contrast to what transpired within the house's walls. That change, the product of local activism and municipal sanction around 2018, was not a ceremonial gesture alone. For descendants, community activists, and educators, the renaming functioned as a civic correction, a city signaling, however belatedly, that the language of rights must extend into urban memory. The new name invited reflection in passers-by, an official prompt to ask who stood for those rights when they were first denied here. In 2023, a more concrete project took shape. A coalition of local historians, memory activists, architects, and descendants proposed a memorial and educational program to be located either within the preserved mansion or on adjacent public land. The plan combined a small interpretive center with an oral history archive, a modest monument listing known names, including, where documentation permitted, those we have mentioned, and a schedule of educational programming focused on urban slavery and restorative approaches to memory. The project's coordinators sought to foreground the humanity of the people who had been held on the site, not the spectacle of the hauntings. Their stated aim was to create a place for learning, remembrance, and community dialogue, a practical intervention that linked memory to civic education. After the memorial project was announced and some conservation work began, residents reported an interesting shift. Neighbors who had previously described nightly sounds or curious lights said the phenomena receded. Whether this attenuation resulted from structural repairs, insulating old windows, removing unstable timbers, or from the symbolic act of public recognition is a matter of interpretation. Many involved in the memorial work argued that acknowledgement and respectful commemoration play a role in ceasing the patterns of communal anxiety that feed haunting narratives. In other words, when a community takes responsibility for a painful past and makes it visible in a dignified way, some forms of collective distress may ease. Throughout these developments, rituals of local remembrance multiplied. Community groups organized monthly gatherings near the mansion's gates, simple ceremonies of naming, song, and testimony. On certain anniversaries, descendants and residents placed candles in the courtyard and read aloud the names that archival work could verify. These acts were small and eloquent, not attempts to eradicate memory, but to transform how it lived in public life. The street's new name and the memorial project together signaled a civic commitment to turn private brutality into public education. If the mansion's presence in São Paulo's cultural imagination raises questions about ghosts, death, and the uncanny, it raises even more pressing questions about justice. Haunting, if we use the term loosely, functions as metaphor and summons. It is a call to account for how a society treated some of its members and how it has, for generations, chosen to remember or forget that treatment. The persistence of stories about the mansion, the diary folded into a curtain seam, the children's drawings at a school that closed, the scattered municipal notes, all these are invitations to confront historical silence. We are left, finally, with a moral ledger that refracts into many small acts. On one level, the mansion is a physical site that will require careful preservation, structural stabilization, archival conservation, and interpretive programming. On another level, it obliges civic practice, school curricula that teach urban slavery's legacies, support for descendants tracing family histories, and public investments in memorial work that refuse to reduce victims to mere backdrops for sensation. The haunting, in the metaphorical sense, is a demand for such measures. There is also a human responsibility in how we tell this story. To recount the mansion's history is not to indulge in sensational drama, but to restore human names to public memory. Maria Benedita's clandestine pages, the testimony of neighbors like Donna Carlotta Mendez, the recollections preserved by people such as Manuel Tavares, and the drawings of children from Rui Barbosa School are not curiosities. They are primary traces of lives lived under constraint, and of communities that have borne the work of memory across generations. When we read Maria Benedita's folded entry, short, steady, and refusing melodrama, we are faced with a straightforward imperative: to listen and to pass on what we can verify with care and humility. What then of the mansion's more extraordinary claims? Voices on tapes, faint figures on old plates, cold spots in certain rooms. The careful response, endorsed by the academic teams and by ethical investigators who visited over decades, is to record such phenomena as testimonies. They exist in the sense that people reported them consistently, sometimes across generations. They are elements of a social archive. They are not by themselves proof of metaphysical entities. Rather, they are part of an entangled field in which memory, grief, architecture, and suggestion interact. Whether or not one believes the house is literally haunted, the persistence of these stories means the site carries moral weight for the city. As night falls again on Rua dos Direitos Humanos, the mansion's silhouette is a shape that insists. Names matter. For those who pass by, for students who study urban history, for descendants seeking traces of their ancestors, the house has become a text to be read slowly. Its cracks and cornices contain more than architectural neglect. They contain choices a city still has to make about how to remember and to repair. Memory projects, heritage listings, educational programs, and material conservation are modest remedies in the face of a profound theft, the seizure of human lives and their labor. They are nonetheless necessary. If the story of the Santos mansion teaches one thing, it is that ghosts, whether imagined, remembered, or manifested, are never merely private phenomena. They are public symptoms of unacknowledged harm. Restorative action is not simply symbolic. It changes how communities relate to places and to one another. It brings names into the open. It funds archives and supports descendants. It turns rumor into curated testimony, and municipal neglect into civic responsibility. We close where the story began, with names and with an invitation. Maria Benedita, Benedito Angola, and Inácio are more than motifs in a tale of the uncanny. They were people whose lives and struggles help us understand the tangled aftermath of slavery in an urban center. The mansion at Rua dos Direitos Humanos still stands as an emblem, a house that the law did not immediately empty, whose social consequences ripple into our present. If this account has struck you, consider helping the work of remembrance. Share this story so these names are not forgotten. Look into the primary documents and archival scans linked in the description. They are the traces we have to build careful memory from. And, where possible, support the memorial and educational initiatives gathering around the mansion. Visit, donate, or participate in programs that teach about urban slavery and the ethics of commemoration. The act of remembrance is not passive. It is a civic practice that asks us to transform knowledge into responsibility. Under the sodium lamps, the house endures. Whether those who have passed remain in ways that evade empirical description, or whether the sounds that people heard were the echoes of unresolved grief, the result is the same: a city called to remember. The silence that follows public acknowledgement is not erasure, it is a space for repair. In honoring names, restoring archives, and creating places for learning, we make a different kind of presence. A presence that refuses the amnesia that allowed such a house to become a site of unexamined harm. This is the smallest justice the city can offer, that people once reduced to property might return to history as persons whose lives matter.